What do you think the median student loan debt is in America right now? $40,000? 50? Maybe as high as 100? No. The median student loan debt in America right now is sitting just over $20,000. That's less debt than the average American has on a used car payment. And total student debt is 4 times smaller than the amount of money the stock market lost last Friday, and is almost identical to the amount of money that young people pay towards Social Security every single year. It's pennies in terms of the total US economy. And yet, every conversation around student loans treats it like this national epidemic that's ruining the lives of American families, all while ignoring the proven return on investment that college has on lifetime earnings and the insanely positive impact that education has had on productivity and the value of the US economy. But what if I told you that that's exactly the point? That there are multiple interest groups who want to convince you that college is a scam so that they can siphon even more money out of the working class, destroy the economy to manipulate voters, and reduce the competition that their kids will have in the future. Well, that's exactly what I'm going to be talking about today. But before we get into all of these people, we need to have a better understanding of the lived reality of the student debt situation. Like I said, the median student debt is sitting between $20,000 and $24,000. And of the people who owe more than 25, over half of them have advanced degrees, like doctors, lawyers, and PhDs. This mythical 18-year-old who's taking out $100K for an art history degree just doesn't exist in the data. They are a severe outlier who we only hear about whenever finance podcasts use their stories as rage bait. They just aren't real. The overwhelming majority of graduates are able to handle their student loans, regardless of what they studied and regardless of how much money they took out. Only 13% of bachelor's degree holders from public universities are behind on their student loans, a number that drops down to 11% when you look at graduates of private schools. And as people get older and start to change careers, they become increasingly likely to report that their college education was worth the money. See, the truth of the matter is that 3/4 of all college graduates will end up going into a different field than what they originally studied. Whether that's a philosophy major going into business to pursue jobs, or whether that's a software engineer going into the nonprofit sector after tech layoffs. Market conditions, changing priorities, and new jobs getting created because of evolving technology means that no degree will stay relevant forever. But that doesn't mean that a college degree is wasted just because somebody with a biology degree isn't working as a biologist. In fact, it's quite the opposite. College graduates almost always have a leg up in careers because traditional universities hold a complete monopoly over the entry-level job market. The employer relations staff at universities are working day after day to make sure that the best companies, the best internships, and the best entry-level full-time jobs across industries are coming to their career fairs to recruit their students. It just wouldn't make sense for a company to post a real entry-level job on Indeed when they can take a single afternoon, go to a local university career fair, and have them spoon-feed them hundreds of interested candidates. That's why there are over 500,000 people working in talent acquisition across North America, because university partnerships are big business. And generally speaking, the more a university costs to attend, the higher paying jobs that they are expected to provide their students, which is part of why graduates from private schools are less likely to be behind on their loans, on top of having daddy's money. Let's say that somebody does go to college and takes out $100K in loans on an art history degree. If they went to an Ivy League school, then the odds that they can get a job somewhere like Goldman Sachs are extremely high, so long as they have baseline communication and critical thinking skills. University corporate partnerships are just that powerful. Unless you're becoming an engineer, a teacher, or a doctor, the real value of a college education is not the sheet of paper that you get at the end. It's the social capital that you obtain from everything else that a university has to offer. Hashtag become your own Nepo baby. So when you survey people who went to college and finished, the overwhelming majority report that their earnings in their career are significantly higher than they would have been had they not gone to college. Whereas the people who don't believe that college was worth the tuition money are overwhelmingly people who dropped out or who did not receive a bachelor's degree. We'll absolutely talk about the dark side of community colleges and technical schools here in a minute when we get to these guys, but I want to get the point across that the reality of student debt in America is not nearly as bad as it seems, especially when you compare it to the average debts that Americans carry on things like cars, credit cards, and mortgages. Outside of mortgages, assuming that you can actually afford yours anyway, consumer debt can almost never be considered an investment. Your car loses value the second you drive it off the lot. And while I'm sure that vacation to the Caribbean was very relaxing and you came back and were more productive, that increase in productivity probably didn't offset the credit card debt that you took out in order to go. Consumer debt is just not an investment. Putting money in the market, starting a business, and going to college are some of the only times where spending money actually makes you money. Yet while we applaud people putting money in Roth IRAs or becoming entrepreneurs, online culture has heavily vilified going to university over the past 2 decades. And the reason why is, ironically, because a bachelor's degree from a traditional university is very likely to actually pay off. And the people in power know this. 80% of businesses fail within 10 years, so young entrepreneurs aren't really seen as a threat to the powers that be. In fact, they actually help rich people by further glorifying the idea of being a business owner online. But the institution of higher education is absolutely a threat to these 6 different interest groups, and they want to see it fail. So I am going to go through all of them one by one, starting with finance influencers. Sorry, gotta save the juicy ones for the end to keep that watch time up. If you saw this video in your feed, then there's a very good chance that you consume content about money. So when I criticize finance influencers, I'm very much talking about grifters in the personal finance and investment spaces. People trying to sell courses, people trying to get you to buy into get-rich-quick schemes like crypto, dropshipping, MLMs, and all of that other slimy stuff. I won't name names, but you've all seen these guys. So why am I talking about them? If it is true that somebody who went to college earns an average of $1.2 million more in lifetime earnings compared to somebody from the same socioeconomic background who did not go to college, then why aren't finance influencers encouraging you to go to college? Well, it's the same reason why fitness influencers avoid talking about calories, and why lifestyle coaches focus so much more on self-love than they do on actually getting enough sleep at night. Because those are the things that actually work. And if these influencers actually help you, then they end up losing a customer. So they end up pushing a bunch of shit that sounds good in theory, but doesn't actually address the core issue, because their business model is based off of you either never taking action or only taking actions that won't work for everyone over the long term. And the same goes for these finance gurus online. If they've got a bunch of 18-year-old boys watching their videos, then they are going to prey on that demographic's anxieties and addictions. They're going to tell them that colleges are full of woke DEI warriors who are going to hate them for being born a straight white male. And then they're going to play on masculine shame by telling these boys that they're a failure if they aren't a millionaire. And then they're going to take it a step further by playing on the risk-taking side of young male hormones and convince them to buy their courses on things like crypto, dropshipping, and day trading. It's the modern day version of the gold rush. Vulnerable young men are the guys heading to California to pan for gold, while finance gurus are the guys actually getting rich in Reno, Nevada, selling denim jeans or working at the casinos. It's the exact same thing. But let's shift gears here and talk about alternative schools. I'm about to give a very hot take. And so I need to preface this by saying that I am a job market economist who has been working in higher education since 2018 professionally and has made it my career goal to financially empower young adults like myself who come from poor socioeconomic backgrounds. I think that most community colleges are evil and a scam in their current iteration. And I know that that is a very hot take, so let me back it up with data. Generally speaking, the point of a community college is to give young adults the opportunity to take their generals and explore college majors while paying a lot less money in tuition so that they can transfer those credits to a bachelor's degree at a 4-year university. In theory, that is damn good advice. In practice, that is not what's happening at all. Only about 1/3 of community college students ever end up transferring, and of the third who do, less than half actually complete a bachelor's degree in 6 years. That means that if you are an 18-year-old and you start at a community college, then there is only a 16% chance that you will ever obtain a bachelor's degree and therefore make the cost of college worth it. Compared to the 71% of 18-year-olds who start out at a traditional university and graduate, or the 80% who start out at private universities and graduate. Now, I do need to give the caveat that community colleges tend to be located in major cities and therefore attract more people from poor socioeconomic backgrounds who tend to have other priorities in place that get in the way of college and eventual graduation. However, I would personally make the case that most community colleges are actually preying on these people and not really trying to lift them out of urban poverty. They know that their graduation rates are low, they know that they don't provide job placement, and they know that associate's degrees are not taken seriously in the job market. And they know that all of their remedial general courses will never transfer to a 4-year university, and therefore extend the amount of time and money that students are spending while they're there with them. See, my personal opinion from observations is that community colleges are targeting two very specific types of students. One is urban students who should have never enrolled in college to begin with because school is just not for them, and the other are students who come from poor backgrounds but should be in traditional 4-year universities because they're good at school and are only going to a community college, again, because they grew up poor and feel the obligation to arbitrage their education instead of taking out unnecessary debt. But that belief completely flies in the face of what we actually see in the data. There is just something about the stability and the financial backing of universities. The ability to live in the dorms, to make friends freshman year who can stay with you your entire life, the access to internships, research, and career fairs, the mental health counselors, the gyms, the world-class facilities, that all just kind of snowballs into young adults becoming more confident and competent versions of themselves, therefore becoming more competitive in the job market in both the short and long term. Most alternative schools are just not really good. And that's not just community colleges. That includes things like technical schools, online schools, coding boot camps, and online micro-credential programs. Some of these things are pretty great, like trade schools overwhelmingly are fantastic, but the overwhelming majority of alternatives to traditional universities do not provide good outcomes for their students and do not provide adequate resources. They just can't compete with a traditional college education, which is why advocates of those alternative schools vilify universities online. On top of the fact that a lot of them are being funded by corporations and billionaires who want to devalue the cost of labor in their field and therefore fund shitty forms of education. But we'll get into that a lot more towards the end of this video. Let's shift gears and talk about banks. You've heard of finance influencers? Now get ready for IRL finance employees. So, much like people selling courses on social media, the business model of banks generally depends on people not being responsible with their money, because a lot of the money that banks make comes from interest interest on loans, overdraft fees, and late fees. You know, the type of things that poor people have. And so it makes sense why the finance industry isn't super keen on most people making positive long-term financial decisions. However, it goes a lot further than that. There are two really nefarious things that the finance industry is doing whenever it pushes an anti-college narrative online. As society becomes more anti-college, people start depending less on FAFSA-based loans that are managed by the federal government, and instead start taking out more private options through banks to do things like go to a coding boot camp or to start their own business because they can't get a job because, again, universities hold a monopoly on the entry-level professional job market. And since 80% of businesses fail within the first 10 years, banks are more than happy to dish out those loans and collect the interest on them. In essence, banks view traditional universities and the federal government as their literal business competitor for revenue on loan interest. But the other thing that the finance industry is doing when it vilifies college online is actually insane. And it's that they are trying to eliminate the competition so that their kids are the only people who can viably get into their own companies, thus perpetuating their family's generational wealth. I know that sounds like some wacky conspiracy theory, but the finance industry is literally built up around this practice. See, universities have a historic system in place called legacy admissions. This is where the children or close relatives of alumni are given preferential treatment in the college admissions process. So if you went to Harvard, then your son is probably also going to get into Harvard if they have at least decent grades. This started in America in the 1920s because of racism, but perpetuated because wealthy Americans realized that this was a really effective way of safeguarding generational wealth and had been being done by rich people in Europe for centuries. It's not that uncommon for executives in businesses to only allow internships or entry-level jobs to be filled by students at their own alma mater. And sure, this doesn't guarantee that your kid will be the one to get the internship at the finance firm, but it does trickle down into almost everyone at your company being from one of 3 different schools, and eventually, after a generation or two, all of the interns at your company end up being the kid of at least somebody at that company, which creates these dynasties in finance where you have these extended families with a bunch of top executives who all went to like the same 3 different schools. But this approach isn't completely foolproof. There's this pesky little nobility clause in the US Constitution that works really hard to stop public institutions from granting hereditary privileges as a perk of receiving donations, and serves as a safeguard against me attaining my ultimate dream of becoming the Duke of Idaho. Anyway, finance firms know this. They know that they can't only hire from 3 schools, and they know that they can't only hire their coworkers' kids. Some outsiders are going to slip through the cracks. So the finance industry uses a simple yet elegant solution to make sure that only the most privileged outsiders make their way into the system: the unpaid internship. In my work in higher ed, I pretty much only see unpaid internships nowadays from the finance and government sectors. Why? Because that ensures that only young people from financially privileged families will be able to go into those fields. People who are likely to hold beliefs that support the industry and are therefore the most likely to perpetuate generational wealth in finance or in the government. What they don't want is someone like me, who was born to a single mom in Las Vegas, to get my grubby little mitts on the finance industry, because I'm incredibly angry about the childhood that I experienced as a result of income inequality. And now that I have a master's degree and industry experience and economic expertise, I use those education skills and experiences to actively antagonize corruption in the system. And so if a bunch of people like me, i.e. normal people, ended up integrating into finance or the government, the current systems that are established would eventually collapse, because I could not bring myself to push policies that negatively impacted young people growing up like I did. Like, even if this whole YouTube thing takes off and I make millions of dollars a year in ad revenue or whatever, I don't think that I could morally invest in residential real estate because I perceive that practice as being evil because I grew up poor and had been abused by people who were involved in residential real estate. And that's why unpaid internships exist, because people like me would never have been able to do them when they were in college. And ultimately, these finance firms don't want other people competing against their own kids. So you get these rich dudes in the industry who vilify universities online, but then still force their own kids to go to Harvard because they understand that a traditional college education has legitimate value. Next up, we've got tech companies. Digital technology is still pretty new, so there's not a lot of generational wealth in this space yet. So the reason why tech bros tend to be so anti-college online is because they want to drive the cost of labor down. Tech jobs usually require a lot of education, and that generally drives salaries up, which the tech industry sees as a problem. I used to sit on the executive board of this nonprofit that worked to connect companies in my state to all of the local colleges so that we could make sure that local graduates were actually getting recruited locally. And there was this one very large tech company, which shall remain nameless, that refused to work with us, no matter how much we reached out to them. And for a while, I thought this was absurd. Like, they literally needed hundreds of computer scientists locally every single year. And that was until finally, I got to have coffee with one of their more open talent acquisition people by chance, and they told me point blank that that company refuses to hire locally because if they hire American computer scientists, then they will be expected to pay them a livable wage. So what they do instead is hire CS graduates from South Asia, pay them minimum wage, and then refuse to renew their visas once they run out. And then they have the audacity to go on social media and talk about how global and diverse their workforce is. It's pretty disgusting, and is a lot more common than you might think. Anyway, it's no surprise then that tech companies tend to be pretty outspoken in the anti-college narrative online. And it makes sense why they try so hard to create their own college alternatives and to push things like micro-credentials so that people can just get the bare minimum skills that they need to do a job in tech without having a full-blown computer, software engineering degree that would demand a much higher paycheck. Amazon has AWS, Microsoft has LinkedIn Learning, Google has career certificates, etc., etc., etc. And I don't know, man, in theory, I don't hate this. It's like community colleges, right? But whenever I go on LinkedIn and whenever I see these companies' actual high earners working in tech, pretty much all of them have traditional bachelor's degrees from pretty well-respected universities. I'm just never seeing instances of some dude from rural Kentucky not going to college, going to a coding boot camp one summer, and then landing a six-figure job at a major tech company. I just don't see it. College alternatives and micro-credentials just kind of look like a cultural pandering cash grab, in my opinion. Also, speaking of LinkedIn, hi, urgently editing here. I literally just saw that the top story on LinkedIn News today is saying that student loan delinquency has surged from 8% to 13% as a result of the end of student loan deferment. But here's the thing. That 8% was from 2020. So they are making a 5-year comparison to a time that was, get this, a little unusual. And that 13% delinquency was a number that we already had from last December when the Federal Reserve released this data. Like, it's literally propaganda and manipulation, and really goes to show just how incentivized these tech companies are to convince people that the student loan situation is worse than it is. Anyway, that's all I had to say. Back to the video. All right, you've stuck with me this long, you've eaten your broccoli, and now it's time for dessert. Let's talk about politicians and billionaires, the best part of living in America. It won't shock anyone when I say that our government is pretty hostile towards higher education right now. The executive branch is trying to take down the Department of Education, individual states are slashing hundreds of millions of dollars from their public universities, and Republican think tanks, which hold a majority in the government right now, treat universities like they are this breeding ground for enemies of the state. Trust me, I did my college internship at one of these think tanks, and they are filled with nut jobs. At the end of the day, politicians, billionaires, and really anyone with power is concerned with maintaining and growing their power. They want money, they want to get reelected, and they want the general public to support policies that help preserve their power. Being anti-education helps push a lot of the agendas of the current regime, in the same way that focusing on identity politics and ignoring the economy completely helped push a lot of the agendas of the previous regime. That's regardless of your politics, that's just kind of how things work in America. Extremist viewpoints are given a megaphone, while a lot of us more moderate people are completely ignored. In fact, I can literally hear the extremist people in the comments right now getting angry that I referred to myself as a moderate. But bringing it back to education, it doesn't help that a lot of politicians and billionaires became heavy investors in alternative schools and micro-credentials in the 2010s at the height of tech fervor. And again, I won't name names, but there's a pretty public track record of investment companies, tech billionaires, CEOs, politicians, and so on having college alternatives like Coursera, the Khan Academy, and School as part of their investment portfolio. And so the more that normal people see traditional university as a waste of money, the more that they're going to leverage those alternatives in order to try to secure themselves a job, which ends up creating more money for shareholders in those programs. Like, it's not really a conspiracy so much as it is just good business. However, that good business is happening at the expense of really important things, like medical research, the sustainability of the American middle class, and young people's ability to do things like get married and have kids, something that's extremely easy to do at a university and extremely hard to do on Tinder as a graduated adult. Last year, the amount of discouraged male workers in America grew 50%. That means that these young men are not only unemployed, but they have also stopped looking for a job entirely because they believe that they are not qualified to gain meaningful, high-paying employment in their local economy. This is a problem that universities are uniquely qualified to solve. The loneliness epidemic is a problem that universities are uniquely qualified to solve. Because when you look at the track record of things like community colleges, technical skills, and online alternatives, they just don't deliver the same results. And I feel like it's pretty short-sighted and dishonest of politicians to take money away from established traditional universities and give them to these more smaller alternatives, thinking that that's going to fix the economy or the loneliness crisis. And I don't think that they even buy into that idea either. In my opinion, they are just pandering to people who see higher education as a threat to the state or a threat to the powers that be, who just want to get their kicks off watching universities fail. We've all heard that expression that you should buy the dip. This is where you buy a surplus of stocks during a recession because inevitably the market will go back up and that will give you a much higher return on investment. If I had to predict the future, I think we're going into the dip as far as education goes. Young men especially are dropping out of colleges left and right, college is under a lot of scrutiny from the government, and program funding is getting slashed everywhere that you look. However, education has been one of the most powerful forces in human history, and eventually the pendulum is going to have to swing back the other way. And as we approach this enrollment cliff in higher education, a college degree will probably become a hot commodity again 10 to 20 years down the line. And the education, skills, and experiences that a traditional university provides will absolutely pay dividends once the 20-year-olds of today acquire their degrees and then finally get a foothold in their professional careers. They just have to be willing and able to ignore all of the propaganda, ignore all of the gambling, and be willing to make a long-term investment in their future, even if it means taking several years and even if it means taking out a little bit of debt.